There's a specific kind of chaos that only Shifter Academy romance can produce, and I want to talk about it. I want to sit down with you for the next however long this takes and really dig into what Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates is doing, because this show came out of nowhere and landed on me like a freight train I absolutely did not see coming, and I mean that in the best possible way, mostly. This is the kind of story that sounds ridiculous on paper, that you describe to a friend and watch their face go through 17 different expressions, and yet when you are actually in it, when you are actually watching it unfold episode by episode, something genuinely interesting is happening underneath all the fur and fire and territorial posturing. Something that kept me up way later than I intended on more than one night. Welcome to Jonota News, by the way. If you are new here, this channel is where we go deep on the stories that deserve more than a thumbnail and a star rating, and if that sounds like your kind of thing, a subscribe genuinely goes a long way. Now, quick note before we dive in, I'm working at a moderate spoiler level today, which means I'll be getting into some significant turns and relationship dynamics and mid-series reveals, but I'm going to protect the biggest endgame moments and final resolutions for those of you who haven't finished yet. If you've seen everything, a lot of this will still resonate. I think there's plenty to chew on regardless of where you are in the story. And if you are completely new to this world, don't worry, I'm going to give you enough context that everything tracks. Let's go. So, a human girl at a school full of shifters. During mating season. The premise alone tells you exactly what kind of story this is going to be and also somehow still manages to underdeliver on how insane the actual execution gets. Ivy, our lead, our anchor, our very human heart at the center of all of this, is not someone who asked for any of this. That's the first thing the show establishes with real clarity and real care, and it's crucial that you understand that, because Ivy's lack of agency in how this situation began is actually the engine of everything that comes after. She's on scholarship. She fought for that scholarship. She comes from a background where educational opportunity doesn't just fall into your lap, where you claw for every inch of access, and Shifter Academy represents something she earned through pure determination. The fact that the academy also happens to be populated almost entirely by apex predators in humanoid form, wolves, lions, hawks, bears, the full taxonomy of nightmare, is something she was presumably aware of going in, but awareness and lived reality are very different things. She knew what the place was. She did not know what the place was going to do to her specifically. The mating season element is where the show really plants its flag in provocative territory, and I think it's worth talking about what that concept is doing structurally and thematically before we even get to the three alphas. Mating season in this world isn't just a biological inconvenience or a dramatic plot device, although it is absolutely both of those things. It functions as a kind of truth serum for the entire academy ecosystem. Every social dynamic, every power structure, every carefully maintained facade of civilization that these students and faculty have constructed gets stripped back. Instincts override performance. The masks come off. And for Ivy, who is fully human and therefore not subject to the same biological pressures, mating season puts her in a uniquely dangerous and uniquely clarifying position. She can see everyone clearly when everyone else is operating at reduced rationality. That asymmetry is genuinely interesting, and the show minds it well. She becomes, almost accidentally, the only fully clear-eyed person in a building full of apex predators running on something closer to instinct than reason, and that gives her a kind of power that nobody, including her, quite expects. Now, the three alphas. Ronan, Leon, and Talon. I need to spend real time on each of them because the show does something smarter than you might expect with how it constructs their individual personalities, their individual relationships with Ivy, and the ways in which they circle each other with barely contained violence while also, gradually, grudgingly, circling each other with something that looks a lot like mutual respect. These are not interchangeable love interests differentiated only by hair color and attitude. They are genuinely distinct characters with distinct wounds and distinct ways of moving through the world, and the show earns a lot of goodwill just by taking that seriously. Ronan is the one you meet first, and he is immediately a problem. Not in the charming, fun-to-watch way, in the actually abrasive, why are you like this way? He's a wolf shifter, which the show uses to inform everything about how he occupies space, territorial, hyper-aware of hierarchy, physically imposing in a way that reads less as attractive and more as a warning. His first encounter with Ivy is the moment the show's tagline, "Love at First Slap," stops being a clever hook and becomes a literal plot beat, and I want to be precise about what actually happens there because the staging of that scene is doing a lot of work. Ivy is navigating the academy's main hall on her first day, carrying more than she can comfortably manage, clearly running on nervous energy and zero sleep, and Ronan walks through her. Not around her. Through her, like she's furniture, like the concept of yielding to another person's path has never once occurred to him. Her things scatter. There's a beat of silence. And then, and this is what makes the scene, she doesn't apologize. She doesn't scramble to pick things up while he watches. She turns around and she tells him, with remarkable calm, that his parents apparently forgot to include basic spatial awareness in his upbringing. And Ronan, who I think genuinely has not been spoken to that way in years, possibly ever, is so caught off guard that for a second you can see something shift behind his eyes before the arrogance slams back down like a drawbridge. He walks away without a word. That's the slap. Not physical. Something sharper. The show frames it beautifully. The camera lingers just long enough on Ronan's retreating back that you understand this isn't over, this is only beginning, but the fact that it's Ivy who lands the first blow in their dynamic sets the template for everything between them. Leon is the opposite problem. Where Ronan assaults you with his presence, Leon seduces you with his absence. He's a lion shifter, which in this world's mythology translates to a kind of sovereign self-containment. Lions are pack leaders by nature but individualists by preference, and Leon embodies that tension completely. He is the most academically accomplished student at the academy, which functions as both genuine achievement and elaborate armor. His intelligence is real, but it's also a moat. He keeps people at exactly the distance where he can study them without being studied in return, and for most of his life that's worked perfectly. Ivy breaks that. Not through confrontation, she's not Ronan's mirror, but through simple, infuriating consistency. She sits near him in the library not because she's angling for his attention but because the natural light is better there. She asks him questions in seminar not to impress him but because she actually wants to know the answers. And Leon, who is accustomed to reading people's motivations in about 3 seconds flat, cannot read her. She's opaque to him in a way that's almost physically uncomfortable, and watching him reckon with that discomfort, trying to file it away, failing, returning to it against his will, is some of the finest character work the show has to offer in its first third. Talon is the wild card, and I say that knowing full well that in a story about shifters, wild card is doing a lot of heavy lifting. He's a hawk shifter, which means aerial perspective is hardwired into how he processes the world. He sees patterns, he sees elevation, he sees the shape of things from a distance before he ever engages with them up close. But Talon's particular damage is that he's spent so long observing from a distance that genuine closeness, genuine proximity, has become almost unbearable to him. He's funny in the way that people are funny when they've made humor into a survival mechanism, quick, deflective, always moving the conversation away from anything real. And his initial dynamic with Ivy is the most overtly antagonistic of the three, not because he dislikes her but because she keeps accidentally getting underneath his jokes and finding the actual person, and he finds that alarming in a way he expresses exclusively through sarcasm and strategic disappearance. The first time Ivy genuinely laughs at something real he says, not the joke, the thing underneath the joke, Talon's expression does something complicated and involuntary that the camera catches in a quarter-second close-up, and it's the kind of performance detail that rewards paying attention. What the show is constructing with these three is not a simple spectrum of personality types for Ivy to choose between. It's building a triangle of mutual incompatibility that she somehow sits at the center of, and the question the story is really asking is not which one she picks but what it means that her presence creates a gravitational field strong enough to pull all three of them into orbit simultaneously. The fated mate mythology in this world, and the show does develop its internal rules with reasonable consistency, holds that the bond is not random. It's not arbitrary supernatural selection. The bond recognizes something essential, something that fits together at a level below personality and preference and conscious choice. So the fact that three distinct apex predators, three genuinely incompatible personality architectures, have all been matched to the same human woman is the show saying something. Whether it's saying something about Ivy specifically or about the nature of completeness or about how different kinds of strength find each other is the question the narrative keeps turning over, and I appreciate that it doesn't rush to an easy answer. But let me be honest with you for a second, because this show is not operating at some rarefied literary altitude, it's a shifter academy romance with a reverse harem structure and mating season drama and territorial alpha nonsense, and it leans into all of that with a kind of delirious commitment that I found genuinely charming. There's a scene in the second episode where all three of them independently show up to Ivy's dormitory door within about 4 minutes of each other, each with a different pretext for being there. And the show plays that moment for exactly the right amount of comedy before letting the underlying tension breathe. Ronan's pretext is territory-based and transparently unconvincing. Leon's is academic and slightly more plausible but still pretty thin. Talon just says something like, "I was in the hallway," and doesn't elaborate, which is somehow the most honest thing any of them says. Ivy looks at all three of them arranged in her doorframe like the world's most inconvenient welcoming committee and says, with a patience that she is clearly manufacturing on the spot, that she will speak to each of them individually and that none of them should read anything into the order. And then she closes the door in all of their faces. It's a great scene. The show knows it's a great scene. And the chemistry between all four actors in that moment, the three leads and the actress playing Ivy, is loose and real and perfectly timed in a way that tells you the production spent serious time building comfort between these performers before filming. Speaking of the lead actress, I want to spend real time on this performance because I think it's the thing the show rests on entirely and the thing that will determine whether it works for you or doesn't. Ivy is written as a character who is perpetually slightly overwhelmed but never defeated by that overwhelm. She's reactive, which in lesser hands would make her passive, but this actress makes her reactive in the same way a very good tennis player is reactive, absorbing momentum and redirecting it, staying present, finding the angle. She never plays Ivy as a victim of her circumstances, even when the circumstances are genuinely absurd. There's a quality to the performance that I kept trying to name over multiple episodes. And the closest I can get is, she plays Ivy as someone who is taking everything seriously without taking herself too seriously. She's not above any of this, she's in it, fully, with all the fear and confusion and occasional furious desire that implies, but she retains this thread of ironic self-awareness that keeps the character grounded even when the plot is at its most extravagant. That's hard to do. A lot of performers in this genre either play it too earnest and lose the wit or play it too winking and lose the heart. This actress splits the difference precisely. The actor playing Ronan has the more conventionally difficult job because Ronan is the most conventionally difficult character. The aggressive, territorial alpha is a type that lives or dies entirely on whether you find specific dimension in what could easily be a collection of glowering tropes. And he does find it. The key thing this actor does, which I think is genuinely clever, is that he plays Ronan's aggression as fear. Not consciously, Ronan is not aware that his territorial posturing is anxiety management, but the actor layers it in with the physical choices, the way Ronan positions himself in doorways and at the head of tables, the way his eyes move in any new social configuration to assess threat before he assesses anything else. It's the body language of someone who learned very early that softness was exploitable, and watching that slowly come undone around Ivy, who is about as threatening as a stiff breeze and somehow more unsettling for it, is where Ronan's arc really lives. Leon's actor brings a stillness to the role that I found almost hypnotic. There is something almost watch-like about his performance, precise, measured, every gesture economical in a way that makes the rare moments of genuine emotion land like small earthquakes. He's the kind of performer who does a lot in the eyes and very little everywhere else, which is either thrilling or frustrating depending on your patience, and I'll admit there were moments in the first few episodes where I wanted him to just crack a little, just let something out. When that moment finally comes, and I won't give you the specific episode or context, but you'll know the scene when you see it, it's quietly devastating in a way that the show earns completely because it has been so disciplined about holding it back. Talon's actor has the best lines and knows it, and that self-awareness is actually part of what makes the performance work. There's a quality of genuine enjoyment in how he delivers the comic material that doesn't tip into smugness, which is a real tightrope act. But what elevates the performance beyond good comic timing is what happens in the scenes where Talon can't run. The later middle episodes start trapping him in conversations he can't deflect, and the actor plays the discomfort of genuine emotional exposure with this quality of painful recognition, like Talon is discovering something about himself in real time and doesn't love what he's finding but can't look away from it either. Those scenes are where Talon stops being the funny one and becomes the heartbreak, and I genuinely did not see that pivot coming. The world building in this show deserves its own conversation because it's better constructed than it probably needed to be, and that extra work shows in how the story breathes. Shifter Academy is not just a generic magical school with animal transformation tacked on. The social architecture of the place is thought through in interesting ways. There's a caste system that runs parallel to the official academic hierarchy: wolf packs, lion prides, hawk murders, and yes, the show makes the murder joke, and yes, it lands, and these social structures predate the academy itself. They're ancient, they're biological as much as social, and they create frictions and alliances that have nothing to do with who studies hard or performs well in class. Ivy exists entirely outside these structures, which is both her vulnerability and her strange advantage. She doesn't owe allegiance to any pack or pride. She can navigate between social groups that would never naturally interact. She can see the politics without being subject to them, and the show uses this to great effect in the mid-series episodes when the political dimensions of the maid bond start creating pressure from outside the central four. Because here's the thing about being the fated mate of 3 different apex predators from 3 different social groups, it doesn't just affect you and them. It detonates across the entire social ecosystem of the academy like a bomb. The wolf pack has opinions about Ronan's mate's situation. The lion pride has opinions about Leon's mate's situation. The hawk murder, I cannot say that without the ghost of that joke in my head, has opinions about Talon's mate's situation. And all of these external opinions converge on Ivy in ways that range from hostile to conspiratorial to disturbingly calculating. The show is smart about using these external pressures to force the central relationships forward. It's easy for Leon to maintain his moat when the only person trying to cross it is Ivy. It's much harder when the lion pride is questioning his fitness to lead because his mate's situation is publicly unresolved. Pressure reveals character, and the pressure the show applies from outside the central four is well calibrated throughout. There's also a thread about what it means to be human in a world structured around non-human power, and the show handles this with more nuance than I expected. Ivy isn't powerless in the way that human characters in these kinds of stories sometimes are, written as weakness in need of supernatural rescue. She has specific kinds of power that come precisely from her humanity. She's immune to certain forms of dominant influence that shifters can project. Her emotional reactions are legible to the alphas in ways their own reactions often aren't to each other, and she can form genuine connections with non-aligned parties in ways that the alphas, encumbered by their social hierarchies, cannot. But the show also doesn't pretend that being human in a room full of apex predators is comfortable or safe, and it lets that danger be real rather than decorative. There are moments where you genuinely feel the weight of Ivy's physical vulnerability, and the show doesn't diffuse those moments with easy rescues. It sits in the discomfort long enough to make a point. The academy setting itself, I want to talk about how the show visualized this space, because the production design is doing real work here. The campus architecture is deliberately anachronistic, Gothic stonework and vaulted ceilings alongside brutalist glass and steel, the old and new in unresolved tension, which is obviously a metaphor for the academy's student population but also just looks genuinely striking on screen. The classrooms have a particular quality I kept noticing. They're all slightly too large for the number of students in them, which creates this ambient sense of space and power dynamics, of people claiming territory even within an academic setting. The outdoor spaces are wilder than you'd expect from a school, forest that comes right up to the edges of the grounds, visible from almost every window, a constant reminder of what these students are when the civilizing project of education falls away. The cinematography leans into natural light and shadow in ways that feel deliberate rather than accidental. Interior scenes in the library or the dining hall are often lit with this umber warmth that's almost seductive, while certain key dramatic scenes in hallways or stairwells get a colder, harder light that strips the romance away and makes you feel the danger more directly. It's consistent visual storytelling, and I respected it. The music is an interesting choice across the board. The score operates largely in strings and low brass, which gives the emotional scenes a weight that could tip into melodrama but usually stays on the right side of that line because of how restrainedly it's deployed. The show is not afraid of silence. There are scenes between Ivy and each of the alphas that run for 2 or 3 minutes with minimal score, just ambient sound and performance, and those scenes tend to be the most effective. When the music does come in during these quieter character moments, it tends to be single instrument and sparse, which has the effect of making the full orchestral moments, which the show saves for specific narrative peaks, feel genuinely earned and genuinely impactful. I noticed on my second watch that the show also has distinct musical identities for each of the 3 alphas that weave through their individual scenes. Ronan's motif has something percussive and low in it, Leon's is more harmonic and layered, Talon's has a kind of high-string lightness that sometimes stutters into irregularity, like something in flight catching an unexpected wind. Whether you notice this consciously or not, it works on you. And now I want to get into the specifics of how the central relationships actually develop, because I've given you the setup and the characters and the world, but the texture of the story, the moment-to-moment of how these 4 people navigate an impossible situation, is where I think the show genuinely distinguishes itself from comparable fare. Because you've seen this premise before, in various forms, and the execution is almost always the same, the protagonist resists, the love interests pursue, and eventually she stops resisting and everyone's chemistry problem is solved. Shifter Academy does something more complicated than that, and more interesting. Ivy doesn't resist the bond in the way the genre template usually demands. She doesn't spend 7 episodes insisting these feelings aren't real or trying to run from the academy or perform a kind of emotional denial that the audience can see through from the first scene. She accepts, fairly quickly, that whatever is happening between her and these 3 men is real. What she resists is the loss of autonomy that comes with it. This is a crucial distinction. She's not fighting the feeling. She's fighting the script, the one that says the bond supersedes her choices, that once fate has spoken her opinion is just noise. And that particular resistance is far more interesting to watch, and far more relatable, than standard genre denial, because it's actually about something. It's about whether she gets to be a person with choices or whether she becomes a symbol of fulfillment in someone else's story. Every beat of her arc connects back to that question, and the show doesn't let it go. Ronan's arc is the first one to break open, and it happens in a scene that I keep returning to because of how quietly and unexpectedly it arrives. By the midpoint of the series, Ronan and Ivy have established a rhythm of hostility and reluctant proximity that both of them are pretending is normal. He's been showing up in her orbit constantly, protecting her from external threats while simultaneously being an internal threat himself, which is a contradiction he manages through aggression rather than self-examination. And then there's a night, it's late, the academy is quieter than usual, the mating season pressure has been building for episodes and everyone is slightly frayed, and Ronan finds Ivy sitting in one of the academy's old stone courtyards, not upset exactly, just sitting with something, working something out, and he sits down next to her without saying a word. Not claiming territory. Not establishing dominance. Just sitting. The camera stays wide at first, these 2 figures in this old stone space with the forest visible at the edges of the frame, and then it slowly comes in, and you realize Ronan is looking at her the way he looks at the forest, like it's something real, something that won't disappear if he acknowledges it. She says, without looking at him, "You can go." And he says, "I know." And he doesn't go. That's the scene. That's the whole scene. And it does more work for their relationship than the previous 4 episodes of verbal sparring combined. The show has a real gift for these small, structurally simple moments that carry enormous emotional weight, and I think it's because the writing trusts the performers and the performers trust the writing. There's no moment in that courtyard scene where either of them explains their feelings for the benefit of the audience. Nobody is doing exposition on their emotional state. You are just watching two people in a shared silence, and you understand everything. That's actually difficult to write and almost more difficult to perform, and the show does it repeatedly across all three relationship threads. Leon's breakthrough comes later. And it's more intellectual in its architecture than Ronan's, which is exactly right for who Leon is. The scene that cracks him open happens in his own territory, the library, which Leon has always treated as his personal domain, the place where his version of control is most complete, and it involves Ivy asking him something nobody has apparently thought to ask him before. Not about his coursework or his pride or his plans. About what he's afraid of. The question lands like a stone in still water. Leon's face does this controlled collapse, the stillness holding, and then something small and real flickering through, and he says, very quietly, that he's afraid of being wrong about something that matters. And you understand in that moment that Leon's extraordinary competence is not confidence. It's a system built around never being in a position to fail, and the mate bond, which he cannot think himself out of or study himself through, is the first thing in his life that has put him in that position. Ivy doesn't tell him it'll be okay. She doesn't offer comfort in a conventional sense. She says that she's wrong about things constantly and hasn't died from it yet, and the look he gives her, this complex, involuntary, almost helpless thing, is the performance of the series. Talon takes the longest to crack, which makes thematic sense given that his whole architecture is avoidance, and the show makes the excellent choice of not rushing it. His turning point doesn't come from a single scene but from a cumulative erosion, all of Ivy's consistent, patient presence wearing down his deflections until one day he makes a joke and she doesn't laugh, not because she's hurt but because she's watching him, really watching him, and he suddenly can't hide behind it. The scene where he finally stops performing is physically striking. He's mid-joke, mid-deflection, and he just stops. Mid-sentence. The silence that follows is about 4 seconds long, which is an eternity in a performance context, and in those 4 seconds the actor lets everything Talon has been keeping at altitude come down and land. He looks at Ivy and says something that isn't funny and isn't armored and isn't designed to redirect or protect, and it's the most honest thing he's said since the series began. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But I'll tell you it's short. And it's the most Talon thing he could possibly have said. The three-way dynamic between Ronan, Leon, and Talon is also something the show handles with more sophistication than expected. In a lesser version of this story, the three alphas would exist in permanent mutual contempt, held apart only by their shared connection to Ivy, with her serving as the single point of convergence in a triangle of ongoing conflict. And there is that, certainly, they are not naturally compatible, they don't occupy the same social world, their instincts about power and hierarchy and territory put them in constant friction. But the show also develops a secondary thread that I found genuinely affecting, the fact that they are, in a sense, the only three people alive who understand what the other two are experiencing. Nobody else knows what it is to be in this situation, to be bonded to the same person alongside two others, to navigate a feeling that has no social script, no historical precedent, no community of shared experience to consult. And that isolation, perversely, becomes a point of connection. They can't confide in their packs or prides. They can barely confide in Ivy without the situation becoming something else. So they end up, in carefully guarded increments, confiding in each other. The first time this happens is almost accidental. Ronan and Leon are in the same space, the Academy's training facility, very late, and they're both there for the same reason that neither of them will say out loud. They don't fight. They don't pretend the other isn't there. They train side by side in silence for about 20 minutes, and when Leon finally speaks it's to say something entirely practical about training methodology, and Ronan responds in kind, and it's the most civil exchange they've had, and both of them know it's actually not about training methodology at all. The scene is almost funny in how oblique it is, and the show lets it be funny. There's a warmth in the absurdity of two apex predators communicating genuine emotional kinship through the medium of unsolicited fitness advice. The friendship, and I think it does become something approaching friendship, slowly and resistantly and entirely against the will of both parties, between these three is one of the show's quieter achievements. I want to talk about the antagonist structure, because this show doesn't have a clean villain, and I think that's a deliberate and interesting choice. There's no single source of opposition. Instead, there are several intersecting pressure systems that work against Ivy and the three alphas in different ways. The Wolfpack's senior members, who see Ronan's mate's situation as a political liability, are the most overtly hostile. They apply pressure on Ronan directly, and when that fails, they start applying pressure on Ivy, which is where things get genuinely dangerous. The Lion Pride's leadership is colder and more calculating. They don't threaten, they withdraw support, they create conditions where Leon's position becomes untenable without a resolution to his mate's situation that satisfies Pride politics. And then there's a faculty member. I want to be slightly careful here because this touches on a reveal that's on the edge of what moderate spoilers covers, whose investment in the maid-bond situation goes beyond official capacity and has motivations that the show takes a few episodes to fully surface. This multi-source antagonism keeps the tension from feeling simple or schematic, and it also means that different characters face different kinds of threats, which keeps all three of the alpha arcs individually under pressure. What the show does really well with these external antagonists is that it doesn't let them function purely as obstacles. The Wolfpack seniors who pressure Ivy are also, in their way, genuinely invested in Pack's stability. They're not wrong that an unresolved mate situation creates instability, they're just wrong about the right response to it. The Lion Pride leadership is operating from a genuine tradition of mate-bond resolution that has served Lion society for generations. It just wasn't designed for this specific, unprecedented situation. Even the faculty antagonist, when their motivations are fully revealed, has a comprehensible logic, even if the methods are unacceptable. The show doesn't exonerate any of them, but it does give them interiority, and that makes the opposition feel real rather than functional. The pacing of the mid-series episodes is probably the show's most technically impressive achievement, and also the thing I suspect will divide audiences most. Episodes 4 through 7, the deep middle of the series, are slow. Deliberately slow. The show is doing something that serialized storytelling often sacrifices for momentum. It's letting the characters live in the discomfort of an unresolved situation without providing plot releases to manage the tension. Other characters are changing. The situation is developing. But the central emotional question, what do these four people mean to each other and what are they going to do about it, stays unresolved, and the episodes don't apologize for that. If you are coming to this show from faster-paced, more incident-driven storytelling, those middle episodes might test your patience. But if you can stay with them, there's a richness in that slowness that pays off enormously in the back half. The show is doing what the best slow-burn storytelling does, building pressure with nowhere to release it, so that when the release finally comes, it doesn't feel manufactured. It feels inevitable. The dialogue across the series has a particular texture I want to highlight because it's not what you'd expect from this genre. It's not witty in the scripted, quotable way that a lot of romance serials aspire to. It's witty in a more naturalistic, throwaway sense, lines that make you laugh because they're right, not because they're constructed to land. The show also has a real ear for how people don't say things, the pauses, the subject changes, the indirect approaches that tell you more about what a character is feeling than any direct declaration would. Ronan speaks in short sentences not because he lacks intelligence but because he's learned that giving language to a feeling makes the feeling exploitable. Leon speaks in longer, more structured sentences because he's accustomed to using precision as a kind of control. Talon speaks in fragments and non-sequiturs because complete thoughts are easier to be held accountable for. These aren't just character quirks, they're worldviews expressed through grammar, and the consistency of that across the series is the kind of writing choice that you might not consciously notice but that makes the whole thing feel coherent and true. Ivy's voice is worth talking about separately because it has to do several things simultaneously that would be difficult for most writers to manage. It has to convey intelligence and adaptability and occasional despair and frequent exasperation and genuine desire and a bedrock of self-respect that survives even the most destabilizing moments, and it has to do all of this while also being the connective tissue between three radically different conversational styles. Ivy's speech patterns shift subtly depending on who she's talking to, slightly more direct with Ronan, slightly more structured with Leon, slightly more playful with Talon, and this isn't performance or manipulation. It's genuine attunement. She meets each of them where they are, not because she's making herself smaller but because she's actually listening. That quality, the quality of genuine listening in a world of apex predators who are mostly busy asserting, is what makes her a magnet, and the show encodes it in how she talks. Let me tell you about the moment in the series that genuinely got me. I've been building to this and I want to do it justice. It's in the 6th episode, and it comes after a sequence in which all three of the antagonist pressures have converged simultaneously. The wolf pack has moved against Ivy directly. Leon is dealing with a crisis within the lion pride that is pulling his attention in multiple directions, and Talon, having let his guard down in the previous episode, is in a state of emotional retreat that reads as abandonment even though it isn't quite. Ivy has been handling all of this with the competence and composure the show has established as her baseline, but there's a scene near the end of the episode where she's alone in her dormitory room, late at night, and she's not upset in any performative, photogenic way. She's just sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, holding a piece of paper, her original scholarship offer. It becomes clear, the thing that started all of this, and she's looking at it like she's trying to remember who she was before this. The shot is from the doorway, slightly elevated, and she's small in it, not small because she's weak, but small because the frame is showing you the space around her, the room that's supposed to be her territory and doesn't quite feel like it, the life that's supposed to be hers and has somehow become shared without her consent. There's no music. The only sound is ambient, the distant sounds of the academy at night, which is never fully quiet during mating season. And she folds the paper back up, carefully, and she straightens her spine, and that's the scene. She doesn't cry. She doesn't make a decision out loud. She just resets. Internally. Quietly. And the image of that reset, that completely private act of choosing to continue, is the emotional center of the entire series for me. Nothing that comes before it fully lands without it, and nothing that comes after it would be possible without it. I genuinely did not expect to be as moved by that scene as I was. I was watching this show with a certain amount of amused critical distance, enjoying it, certainly, but from a comfortable remove, and that scene just took the distance away. I found myself putting my tablet down and sitting with it for a minute. That's the thing about this show. It sneaks up on you. Now, one of the places where I want to push back a little against the obvious reading is on the subject of the maid bond itself and how the show treats consent. The easy read, the one I've seen in a lot of discussions of this series, is that the maid bond is a constraint on Ivy's autonomy that the show is endorsing. I don't think that's right. I think the show is far more ambivalent about the bond than a casual reading suggests, and I think it's doing something genuinely interesting with the question of chosen versus unchosen connection. Consider, the bond doesn't create feelings. It reveals them. This is a distinction the show makes repeatedly and with real care. The alphas don't love Ivy because the bond tells them to. They're drawn to her because of specific, legible qualities she possesses, and the bond is, in the show's internal logic, a kind of recognition rather than a command. And Ivy's resistance to the bond is never resistance to the feelings themselves. She's clear-eyed about what she feels, but resistance to the idea that the feelings obligate a specific outcome. The show is actually asking, what's the difference between a choice you make freely and a choice that arises from your deepest nature? Is a feeling chosen if it's authentic? Is autonomy about the origin of a desire or about what you do with it? These are not shallow questions, and the fact that this show is asking them in the context of a shifter academy reverse harem romance is either wildly ambitious or accidentally profound, and honestly I've stopped caring which. There's also a reading of the maid bond as a disability narrative that I found surprisingly resonant, Ivy navigating a social and biological landscape she wasn't built for, developing adaptive strategies, finding power in difference rather than conformity. The show doesn't explicitly frame it this way, and I'm not saying it intended this reading, but it's available in the text, and it deepens the experience if you bring it. The female friendships in the show are underwritten, and I want to name that because it's a genuine weakness. Ivy has two women in her life at the academy, a wolf-adjacent student who functions as a kind of reluctant ally, and a human woman on a different scholarship track who appears mostly in the first 2 episodes and then gets sidelined fairly thoroughly. neither of these relationships is given the room it deserves. The show is so focused on the central four dynamic that it lets Ivy's broader social world become sparse, and while I understand the narrative logic of that choice, keeping the focus tight, it has the side effect of making her world feel slightly smaller than it should. The best version of this story would have given Ivy at least one fully realized friendship outside the central dynamic, not for plot purposes but for the texture of her interior life. As it stands, almost everything we know about who Ivy is comes through her interactions with the three alphas, which works because the interactions are so rich, but still leaves something to be desired. The show also has a tendency in its more action-oriented sequences to lean heavily on the supernatural physicality of the shifters in a way that occasionally tips from exciting into a bit exhausting. The transformation sequences are technically impressive, the production clearly spent real money on the visual effects, and the design work on each shifter form is genuinely striking, particularly Leon's lion form, which is rendered with a detail and weight that makes every scene it appears in feel slightly dangerous, but the mid-series fight sequences run a little long, and they tend to interrupt the relationship momentum at moments when I personally wanted to stay in the emotional space, rather than shift to action movie territory. It's a pacing issue more than a quality issue. The fight sequences themselves are well directed, with a kinetic clarity that makes the geography of the action legible without sacrificing scale, but the placement of a couple of them feels like the show defaulting to external conflict when the internal conflict is actually where the energy is. But here's the thing about the fight sequences, the show is smart enough to use them as character revelations rather than just spectacle, and when it does that, they work beautifully. There's a sequence in the 5th episode where all three of the alphas are responding to the same external threat in real time, and the camera keeps cutting between their three different fighting styles in a way that's almost like counterpoint in music. Ronan's is powerful and direct and physically relentless, Leon's is precise and strategic and almost frightening in its economy, Talon's is fluid and unpredictable and genuinely beautiful to watch. And Ivy, in the middle of all this, makes a choice that affects how the sequence resolves, and her choice is based on reading all three of them, reading their styles, their limitations, their available moves, in real time, and it works, and you understand in that moment that she has been paying closer attention than any of them realized. That's the show at its best, using genre mechanics to reveal character. The visual motive work is worth noting as we move deeper into the series. The show develops a set of recurring images that carry thematic weight without being sledgehammer obvious. The forest at the edge of the campus grounds appears in or through windows in almost every significant scene, and it shifts meaning depending on context. Sometimes it's freedom, sometimes it's danger, sometimes it's the unresolved wildness that the academy exists to contain. Water appears in Ivy's scenes with specific regularity, not rivers or oceans, but smaller, a glass being filled, rain on a window, a fountain in the courtyard. Water as something that takes the shape of whatever contains it, which is maybe the most concise visual metaphor for Ivy's situation that the show could have found. And stone, the academy's stonework, appears in Ronan's scenes more than anyone else's, old stone that has endured without softening. The show doesn't announce these motifs. They just accumulate. The way the show handles the concept of the apex predator social hierarchy in academic settings is also genuinely fun. There's a subtle comedy running through the early episodes about how the civilizing structures of academia, grades, attendance, seminar participation, interact with the very uncivil biological imperatives of these students. There's a class scene where two wolf shifters are having a territorial standoff over seating positions and their professor, a calm, ancient bear shifter who has obviously been managing this for decades and has achieved a sort of zen acceptance of its absurdity, simply rearranges the entire classroom seating chart without explanation and continues the lecture without acknowledging what just happened. It's a small scene. It takes about 45 seconds. And it tells you more about the social texture of Shifter Academy than pages of exposition could. The faculty at large is a fascinating background element that the show could develop more but chooses to leave mostly peripheral, which is actually a smart choice, because making the faculty more prominent would shift the story's power dynamics in a direction that serves the world building but undermines the intimacy of the central relationships. What the show does instead is use faculty characters as brief but pointed interventions, a comment that reframes something, a look that suggests longer history, a moment of unexpected empathy from an unexpected source. The beer professor I mentioned becomes a kind of ambient wisdom figure, not a mentor in any formal sense, just a presence that the show returns to occasionally when it wants to remind you that the institution itself has a perspective on what's happening, and that perspective is longer and calmer than any of the students can access. The question of how this show is going to sustain itself, because by the time you are deep into the middle episodes, you are aware that the central situation is not yet resolved, is one that the show addresses partially but incompletely at this spoiler level. What I can say is that the show does not treat the resolution of the maid-bond situation as simply a romantic logistics problem to be solved. It treats it as a question about the nature of connection and commitment and what it means to belong to someone in a world where belonging has been historically about dominance and possession rather than choice and trust. And the show's answer to that question, or at least the answer it's building toward by the time we reach the point where I'm pulling back on spoilers, is both more hopeful and more complicated than the premise would suggest. There's a version of this story that ends with everything neatly resolved and the bond sealed and everyone happy in a symmetrical way, and this show is not entirely that version, or at least it's not only that version. It's doing something with the idea of resolution that I find genuinely intriguing, and it's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this series at length. The mid-series revelation about the nature of Ivy's scholarship, which the show drops casually and then lets sit for 2 episodes before paying it off, is exactly the kind of structural storytelling I love. Without going into the full detail of what's revealed, I'll say that it recontextualizes Ivy's presence at the academy in a way that simultaneously raises the emotional stakes and gives her arc a new layer of agency. It's not the "she was special all along" beat that this genre often uses to retroactively justify its protagonist's centrality. It's more complicated than that. It's information that makes Ivy's choices both more important and more costly, and the way she responds to it, the way she processes the implications and then decides what to do with them, is some of the finest character writing in the series. The show trusts her to be complex in her reaction rather than simply devastated or simply empowered, and that trust is fully justified. I've been trying to figure out how to talk about the romance itself in a way that's specific enough to be meaningful without giving away the mid to late developments that you should experience on your own terms. So let me talk about it in terms of quality and texture. The romantic content in this show, and there is romantic content, this is a romance, it's not shy about that, is unusually character-specific. The scenes between Ivy and Ronan feel different from the scenes between Ivy and Leon, which feel different again from the scenes between Ivy and Talon, not just because the personalities involved are different but because the show has thought carefully about what each relationship is exploring. With Ronan, the romantic tension is about safety and danger being indistinguishable. Being with him feels protective and precarious simultaneously, and the show leans into that ambivalence rather than resolving it too quickly. With Leon, the romantic tension is intellectual as much as physical. The closest they get to each other is often in an argument, in the shared space of a disagreement rigorously engaged with, and there's something almost erotic about the quality of attention they give each other's thinking. With Talon, the romantic tension is about levity as intimacy, laughter as a way of touching, humor as proximity, and then what happens when the humor drops away and you are left with the actual feeling underneath. 3 different textures, 3 different architectures of connection, all within the same story. The show is also notably good at the physical language of attraction without being gratuitous or self-conscious about it. The way these characters move around each other, the distance management, the almost kiss, the moments when one of them changes direction slightly to be closer to Ivy than a neutral path would require, is choreographed with real precision and played with real naturalness. There's a scene in the library that I keep thinking about where Leon reaches past Ivy to retrieve a book she's looking for, and the geometry of it, how close they end up, the way he doesn't immediately step back, the way she doesn't immediately step forward either, the way neither of them acknowledges what just happened, is a masterclass in filmed sexual tension. Nothing happens. Everything happens. The book is retrieved. The scene moves on. And you spend the next 20 minutes thinking about that moment. Now, around this point in any long piece I like to just pause for a second and acknowledge what I'm actually dealing with here. a reverse harem shifter academy romance that I have just spent this many paragraphs analyzing as though it were a prestige literary drama. And I want to be clear, that's not a joke at the show's expense. It's genuinely what the show demands. Because the thing about *Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates * is that it takes its own premise completely seriously without taking itself too seriously, and that specific combination creates a watching experience where you are allowed to be both intellectually engaged and purely entertained simultaneously. The best genre storytelling always does this. It uses the genre conventions as a container for something that would have been too strange or too vulnerable to exist in another form. The wolves and hawks and lions are doing something. The mating season is doing something. The academy is doing something. And what they're doing is creating a space where questions about belonging and choice and the terrifying possibility of being truly known can be asked in a register where the emotional stakes feel both fantastical and completely real. I have more to say about the back half of the series, about what happens when the external pressures peak, about how the three alphas' individual arcs intersect in a way the show has been building toward from the very first episode, about Ivy's defining choice and what it costs and what it gives back, and about whether this show sticks the landing in the way that its ambitions deserve. But that's going to require stepping past the moderate spoiler line in ways I'm not going to do in this part of the discussion. What I will say, to hold that thread and give you something to carry forward, is this: the show's back half is significantly better than you'd expect if you went in with reasonable genre expectations, and significantly more emotionally demanding than the premise promises. It earns its resolution. It earns it slowly and with real work, and the resolution doesn't look exactly like what you think it's going to look like, and that is a good thing. The show is not perfect. I want to name the imperfections clearly before we go any further, because the things I love about it are more meaningful if I'm honest about where it falls short. The middle pacing issue I mentioned earlier is real and persistent. Episodes 5 and 6 in particular have sequences that stretch longer than their narrative content justifies, and while I understand the slow burn logic, there's a version of those episodes that could have been 20 minutes shorter without losing anything essential. The supporting female characters are genuinely underserved, and that matters for a show whose themes are so directly about what it means for a woman to claim her own choices within a system built around others' power. Ivy's story has real feminist architecture, and the absence of well-drawn female community around her is a gap that the story's ambitions reveal rather than conceal. There's also a subplot involving a secret about the Academy's founding and its original relationship with human students that the show introduces in the third episode and then underserves for most of the series. It picks up again late, and when it does it adds genuine dimension to the world and to the antagonist structure. But the delay is awkward. The subplot just sort of stops existing for about 4 episodes in the middle, and when it returns you have to do a small amount of mental reconstruction to reconnect with it. A tighter editorial hand in the writer's room would have either developed it more consistently across the middle or held its introduction until the back half, where it would have had more room to breathe. The three actors playing the alphas also have varying levels of comfort with the quieter, more interior scenes, and while I've praised their individual performances, and those praises stand, there are moments in group scenes where the tonal calibration between them is slightly off. Ronan's actor and Talon's actor have a natural chemistry that makes their shared scenes feel lived in and easy. Ronan's actor and Leon's actor are slightly less comfortable together in the early episodes, and it shows in a stiffness that doesn't fully serve the scene. By the latter episodes this has improved considerably, and I think that improvement is genuine rather than editorial. You can see them actually relaxing into each other's rhythms as the series progresses, but the early awkwardness is there if you are looking for it. These are real criticisms and not small ones. I want to be clear about that. But they don't undermine what the show achieves, and what the show achieves is substantial. This is a 2026 release that came in with low critical expectations, the genre, the premise, the potential for it to be another glossy but hollow streaming product, and it consistently exceeded those expectations in the areas that matter most. Character depth. Thematic consistency. Emotional truth. The willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolving it for the audience's convenience. And a central performance from the actress playing Ivy that is simply exceptional. the kind of work that anchors an entire series and makes you trust the story even in the moments when the story is demanding a lot of your trust. What I find myself thinking about most, now that I've had some distance from first watch, is the relationship the show builds between wildness and belonging. The Academy is, at its core, an institution built to manage wildness, to create structures and hierarchies and academic frameworks that contain the natural instincts of beings who are, in their deepest selves, not containable. And Ivy, the human, walks into this institution with no wildness that the Academy's systems are designed to manage, and yet she is the one who disrupts everything. She is the one who makes the wildness visible, not by unleashing it but by reflecting it back in a form that these three men can finally see. Ronan's aggression looks different when it's directed at a person who can name it clearly and still choose to stay. Leon's distance looks different when someone crosses it without trying to claim territory. Talon's deflection looks different when someone lets the jokes land without pursuing what's underneath, simply staying present until the underneath surfaces on its own. She's not taming them, despite what the title promises. She's creating conditions in which they can tame themselves, which is a completely different thing and a far more interesting story. I've been thinking about the title actually, Taming Three Wild Mates and how deliberately misleading it is. The taming is not about domestication. It's not about control or submission or the reduction of the wild thing into something safe. It's about the kind of transformation that happens when something feral encounters something that doesn't react with fear or domination, just steady, persistent, infuriating human presence. The wolves have a concept the show references in one of the middle episodes, briefly and without much elaboration, the idea of a tether. Something that doesn't restrict movement but gives the moving thing a point of reference. A place to return to. The show is suggesting, I think, that this is what Ivy becomes for all three of them, not the person who catches them but the person who gives them somewhere to land. And that idea, the tether rather than the trap, is what I want to carry into the second half of this discussion. Because there's a whole second world of things to talk about in this series, and I've barely touched the surface of what the back half has to offer. The back half of this show hits differently. I want to be very specific about that because hits differently is the kind of phrase people use when they mean it got more intense and leave it at that, but that's not quite what I'm describing. The back half of Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates hits differently in the sense that the entire register of the storytelling shifts, not dramatically, not with a jarring announcement of tonal change, but gradually and with real intention, like the show has been in first gear for 7 episodes and quietly, smoothly moves into something with more pull and more grip and more ground covered per moment. You feel it before you can name it. The scenes start costing more. The silences start carrying more. The jokes, when they come, land with a wistfulness underneath them that wasn't there before. And the central question, what do these 4 people mean to each other and what are they going to do about it, stops being philosophical and starts being urgent in a way that has genuine consequences. Let me pick up where I left off with the external pressure systems, because this is where the back half really earns its stakes. By the time you reach episode 8, all 3 of the antagonist forces have moved from ambient pressure to active interference, and the way they do it is not through direct confrontation, at least not initially, but through something more insidious. They start working on the alphas individually, and they do it by targeting not the mate bond itself but each alpha's specific vulnerability. The Wolfpack senior leadership goes after Ronan through his sense of duty, framing the unresolved mate situation not as a personal failing but as an abdication of responsibility to the pack, invoking histories and obligations that predate his birth and that he has spent his entire life structuring his identity around. This is precisely calibrated cruelty. They're not telling him his feelings are wrong. They're telling him his feelings are selfish, which for someone like Ronan, whose entire self-concept is built on being the person who shows up for his people, is a far more effective assault. The Lion Pride's leadership takes the opposite approach with Leon. They give him information. Carefully selected, precisely deployed information about historical mate bond resolutions and the statistical outcomes of the specific configuration he's in. They're not threatening him. They're presenting data. And Leon, who processes the world through information and analysis, finds himself in the nightmare scenario of being given a framework that seems to support a conclusion he doesn't want to reach. The show spends real time on Leon's internal reckoning with this, the way he takes the information, tries to process it objectively, fails to process it objectively, recognizes that his failure of objectivity is itself data about how he actually feels, and then has to sit with what that means. It's a beautiful arc for a character whose defining trait is the belief that feeling and thinking are separable, and the show stages it in a series of brief, precise scenes rather than one cathartic breakdown, which is exactly right. Talon's pressure is the most personal and also the most unexpected. What the Hawk murder? And I fully committed to saying that without the accompanying laugh now, the show has worn me down, does to Talon is give him permission. They tell him the situation is impossible, that three-way bonds without resolution create instability that cascades outward and affects everyone connected to those involved, and that the most rational, most compassionate thing he could do would be to remove himself from the configuration. To step back. To let the others resolve it without his complication. And they frame this not as exile or failure but as the graceful, aerial choice, the hawk who sees the larger pattern from above and makes the sacrifice that the earthbound can't see clearly enough to make. It's psychologically precise in a way that makes my skin crawl slightly even in retrospect, because it's designed to slot into every self-protective instinct Talon has ever developed. It gives him an exit that looks like nobility. It gives him permission to leave before he can be left, which is the thing he has always been most afraid of, dressed up as altruism. The fact that he almost takes it, that there are 2 full episodes where Talon is genuinely withdrawing, genuinely restructuring himself around this decision, and you can't tell whether it's going to hold, is some of the tensest storytelling in the series. What stops him is Ivy, but not in the way you'd expect. She doesn't chase him. She doesn't argue him out of it. She doesn't declare her feelings for him in a climactic speech that breaks through his walls. What she does is simpler and more devastating. She tells him that she's noticed, and she lets him see that she's not surprised. That she half expected this, not because she expected it from him specifically but because she has learned to expect the people she cares about to find a good reason to go. And then she says that she thinks he should make whatever choice is actually his, not the one that looks like sacrifice and functions as escape. She's not holding him. She's just making sure he sees what he's actually doing. The expression on Talon's face in that scene, this long, slow process of his own construction collapsing and something raw and terrified and alive coming up through the rubble, is the single finest moment of the actor's performance in the series. It's extraordinary. And he doesn't decide in the scene. He walks away. And then, 2 episodes later, in a moment that's almost off-screen in its quietness, he comes back. Not dramatically. Just back. Standing in the same doorway where Ivy had spoken to him, and when she opens the door he says the 3 most honest words he has said in the entire series, "I'm not leaving." That's it. That's the whole scene. I could not tell you why that hit me as hard as it did, but I sat with it for a full minute after. The convergence of all 3 pressure systems happens in what I think is the show's structural peak, a sequence spread across episodes 9 and 10 that brings multiple threads into collision simultaneously. There's an event at the academy, something institutional and required, and it becomes the setting for a kind of forced reckoning. Ivy in a room with representatives of all 3 shifter groups, all 3 of the Alphas' social worlds, and all 3 of the Alphas themselves, and the pretense of institutional neutrality dissolves entirely over the course of about 40 minutes of real time. Things are said publicly that were previously only said in private. Positions that were carefully maintained get abandoned under pressure. And Ivy, who has been reactive and adaptive and steady throughout, makes a choice in the middle of this scene that is not strategic and is not safe and is not designed to manage anyone else's comfort, that is simply and completely hers, and it changes the geometry of everything. I'm going to protect the specific content of that choice. But I want to describe its quality, because the quality is what makes it meaningful. It's not defiance for its own sake. It's not a grand gesture designed for impact. It's a very quiet, very clear statement of what she values and what she won't negotiate on, delivered in a room full of people who expected her to negotiate on it, and the stillness that follows is the kind of stillness that happens when something true has entered a space that's been operating on comfortable untruths. The room doesn't immediately change. The political problems don't dissolve. But something has been named that can't be unnamed, and the three alphas, each of whom has been managing his respective crisis partly by maintaining a fiction that Ivy's preferences could be bracketed from the conversation, suddenly cannot maintain that fiction anymore. She has put herself in the room. All of herself. And the show understands that this is, in its own way, the bravest thing she does in the entire series, not because it requires physical courage but because it requires the specific courage of being exactly who you are in a space that has been trying to make you smaller. What follows in the final episodes is not resolution in the tidy sense. I want to be honest with you about this because I think it's important to calibrate expectations correctly. The show does not give you a bow. What it gives you is something more honest, a set of decisions made under full information and genuine agency, a set of relationships that have been stripped of their pretense and are continuing anyway, and a sense of direction rather than destination. The maid bond situation is addressed, but the addressing of it is as specific and character true as everything else the show has done, and it's not the conventional fantasy resolution that the genre usually provides, and I think that's correct. The conventional fantasy resolution would have betrayed the questions the show spent 12 episodes asking. There's a scene near the end that I want to describe with real care, because it's the scene where all three alphas and Ivy are in the same space, not in crisis, not in confrontation, just existing together, and it's the first time the show allows them that. Just existence. Just four people sitting with each other and the complicated, unprecedented, entirely true thing they've become to each other. The space is the courtyard, which the show has been using throughout as a site of significant scenes. It's the same stone space where Ronan sat down next to Ivy in silence midway through the series, and the visual callback is deliberate. But now all four of them are there, and the camera circles them slowly at first and then stills, and the light is that late afternoon umber that the show reserves for moments of genuine warmth. Ronan is on one side of Ivy, not crowding her but close, his shoulder near hers in a way that's become natural. Leon is across from her, reading, actually reading, not performing composure, and occasionally saying something into the air that she responds to without looking up from what she's doing. Talon is slightly removed from the group, perched on a low wall in a way that's very Hawk-encoded, but his face is turned toward them, toward this specific configuration of people, and he's not running a joke or building a deflection. He's just watching with this expression of something that looks, quietly and without drama, like gratitude. And Ivy, at the center of all of it, is working on something, her coursework, presumably, because she is still a scholarship student at an academy and still has work to do, and the show does not forget this, which I love, and she looks up from it at one point and takes in all three of them and says nothing, just breathes, and it's the most complete she looks in the entire series. The camera stays on her face in that moment for about 3 seconds, which in screen time is genuinely long, and what the actress does with those 3 seconds is nothing that can be fully translated into words. It's not happiness exactly, it's something more careful than happiness, something that knows its own fragility and chooses to receive it anyway. The show has earned that image. Every episode has been working toward that image without ever announcing it, and when it arrives it doesn't feel climactic, it feels like recognition. Like yes, of course. Like finally. Now I want to talk about what this show is doing thematically at its deepest level, because I think the surface reading, this is a story about a girl who finds love in an impossible situation, is both true and not quite sufficient. Is part of why I keep returning to this series as something worth taking seriously. The final episode does something I wasn't expecting, which is to end not on a peak emotional moment but on an ordinary one. After everything, and there is a lot of everything in those final 45 minutes, which I am not going to detail but will confirm earns its running time fully, the show closes on something small. It closes on morning. The academy at early morning, the light still pale, the forest mist at the edges of the grounds. Ivy walking to class. Not running, not resolving, not arriving at a new chapter, just walking to class, the way she did in the very first episode. And the three alphas are each visible at different points of this walk, Ronan in the courtyard, Leon visible through a library window, Talon overhead somewhere that the sound of his movement tells you without showing you, and she walks past each of these presences in turn, and each exchange is tiny and private and specific, and she smiles at each of them with a smile that's slightly different each time, that's calibrated to exactly who each of them is. And then she goes into class. And the episode ends. I've been trying to figure out if that ending frustrated me or satisfied me, and I think the honest answer is that it does both, and it was designed to do both. The show is not giving you a statement of conclusion. It's giving you a statement of continuation, which in some ways is more honest to the actual shape of what these four people are navigating. They're not done. They're ongoing. And the show's final gesture is to say, look, here is this ongoing thing in an ordinary morning, and it's enough. That's genuinely lovely filmmaking, and it's also a little infuriating if you wanted a cleaner bow, and both of those responses are legitimate and the show probably anticipated them. Let me talk about the editing in the final episodes specifically, because the back half of the series shows a level of editorial confidence that the first half is building toward but hasn't fully achieved. The cuts in the latter episodes become more associative, images and scenes connected by feeling and meaning rather than strict chronology or cause and effect. There's a sequence in episode 11 that crosscuts between the three alphas, each having separate, private moments of decision. We see each of them alone, with no dialogue, just action, just choice, and the cutting rhythm gradually synchronizes until all three threads are moving at the same pace, converging on the same moment from different angles. It's a formally bold choice and it works completely. The editor is confident enough by this point to trust that the audience has been close enough to these characters for long enough that pure juxtaposition communicates what pages of dialogue would have labored to explain. The sound design in the final episodes also does something interesting. It gets quieter. Not minimalist exactly, but cleaned of the ambient noise that the earlier episodes used to establish the academy as a living, breathing, mating season pressured environment. As the pressure resolves, or more precisely, as the characters find their own center of gravity within the pressure, the sound design reflects that. The academy still sounds like itself, but there's less urgency in it. The score in the final is the sparest it's been since the very first episode, which creates this unexpected full-circle feeling. The show ends in almost the same sonic space it began, before any of this was complicated, but everything inside that space is different now. There's a specific sound cue I want to mention because I think it's the show's most precise piece of audio storytelling. Throughout the series, whenever the maid bond exerts pressure, when the biological and emotional pull is at its strongest, there's a barely audible tone that runs under the scene, not quite music and not quite ambient, something between a frequency and a feeling. It's most noticeable in the courtyard scenes and in certain close contact scenes between Ivy and each of the alphas. In the final episode, during the morning walk ending, that tone is absent. For the first time in the entire series, it's absent. And the absence is not empty, it's resolved. The feeling is no longer pressure. It has become presence. I noticed that detail on my third watch and it broke me a little bit, honestly. The level of thought that went into that, to have a non-musical audio element running subliminally through 12 episodes and then remove it at the moment of resolution without comment or announcement, trusting that the audience will feel the difference even if they can't articulate why, is the kind of craft decision that makes me want to have a long conversation with whoever is responsible for the sound design on this show. Alright, let me come at this from a different angle for a moment, because I've been largely in the business of praise and I want to make sure I'm giving you the full picture. The final episodes are better than the middle episodes, but they are not without their own problems. Episode 10, which is where the public convergence scene happens, the one I described earlier where Ivy makes her defining choice, has a secondary storyline involving a disclosure to the Academy's administration that is handled in a way that feels slightly rushed, slightly underdeveloped. The administration's response to the maid bond situation, which has been building as a potential plot thread since the third episode, lands in about 10 minutes of screen time and resolves with a neatness that doesn't quite match the complexity the show has established around the institution and its relationship to the students' non-academic lives. It's not a significant problem. The plot thread isn't load-bearing for the emotional story, but it's a visible seam, a place where the production was perhaps working against time or resources and made a choice to compress. Episode 11 also has a sequence involving the wolf pack that I think overextends itself slightly. The pack's capitulation, because that's ultimately what it is, the pack's acknowledgement that Ronan's situation is what it is and that their interference has limits, should be a satisfying moment, and it is, but the show lingers on it a beat or two longer than necessary. The deeper story that Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates is telling is about the relationship between wildness and trust. Not taming, I made this argument in the first half and I want to extend it now, but trust. Specifically, the kind of trust that only becomes possible when you have been seen in your wildness and not punished for it. The alphas have all, in different ways, learned to manage and contain and perform around their instincts because the social systems they inhabit reward management and punish authentic wildness. Ronan manages his aggression into protectiveness. Leon manages his emotion into intellect. Talon manages his vulnerability into humor. These are not bad strategies, they're adaptations, and they've worked. But they've worked at the cost of a kind of wholeness, a kind of realness, that these characters can feel the absence of even if they can't name what's missing. Ivy doesn't ask them to stop managing. She doesn't demand authenticity as a performance. What she does is just, not react to the management the way the management expects. Ronan's aggression lands on her and bounces back differently because she's neither cowed nor counter-aggressive. Leon's distance bumps up against her consistent presence and starts to feel less like a choice and more like a habit that's become uncomfortable to maintain. Talon's humor runs into her genuine laughter and then into the silence after genuine laughter when she simply waits, and the silence is not hostile, and so the humor has no function and can stop. She doesn't take anything from them. She just exists in a way that makes their management strategies unnecessary, and in doing so she gives them access to themselves that they've been guarded from for a long time. This is not a small thing to offer someone. It's actually one of the most profound forms of care. And the show is also, in its own way, asking what Ivy gets from this. Not as a commodity, not what she gets from being loved by three powerful men, but what she gets in terms of the specific qualities that the relationship with each of them develops in her. Ronan gives her experience of being physically safe in a world that has made her feel physically vulnerable, and the show does something interesting with her gradual internalization of that safety. She starts taking up more space, physically, as the series progresses. In the early episodes she moves through the academy with this practiced smallness, this energy conservation body language of someone who has learned not to draw attention. By the latter episodes she walks differently. The show doesn't announce this. It just happens. From Leon she gets the experience of being taken intellectually seriously in a space that has categorized her as interesting precisely because she's human and therefore exotic, rather than because she has things worth thinking about. His genuine engagement with her mind, which is real and not patronizing and not filtered through his social hierarchy, is something she doesn't have much experience of, and watching her expand into it is one of the series' quieter pleasures. From Talon she gets permission to be funny and light and not entirely earnest all the time, which Ivy needs more than she knows, because she has been carrying the weight of this situation with such steadiness that she's occasionally forgotten how to be just a person who laughs. The show's treatment of power is also worth extended analysis, because this is a story explicitly about power differentials, 3 apex predators and 1 human woman, 3 members of established shifter social hierarchies and 1 scholarship student from outside all of them, and how it handles that differential tells you a lot about what the show actually believes. The easy version of this story makes the power differential a source of titillation without genuine consequence. The interesting version, which this show works toward, makes it a source of real tension that gets genuinely, carefully resolved through shifts in who defines the terms of engagement. The mate-bond mythology is one lever. In this world's internal logic, the bond gives the human mate a specific power within the bond that overrides standard hierarchy. But the show is smart enough not to let that be the entire answer, because a power that comes from external mythology rather than internal agency is still not fully Ivy's. What the show has to do, and what it does, over time and with discipline, is build Ivy's social power within the Academy ecosystem through her own choices and actions, so that by the time the final episodes roll around, the power she has is not symbolic or mythological but actual. She knows things that matter. She has relationships that are genuinely mutually supportive. She has demonstrated specific competences that have been tested under pressure. The mate bond is part of her power, but only part, and the show ensures that she is not defined by it. This is, in retrospect, what the scholarship thread is about, the one that the show introduced early and then complicated with the mid-series revelation I mentioned earlier but didn't detail. The scholarship represents Ivy's claim to be at the Academy on the basis of her own merit, her own work, her own earned right of access. The complication of that scholarship, and I'll be slightly more forthcoming here without going fully into the reveal, what the show reveals is that the scholarship was not entirely random, that there were factors in its selection that Ivy was not informed of, and that these factors connect to the mate bond situation in ways that complicate her sense of having earned her place fully on her own terms. Is the show directly addressing the question of agency and merit in a context where those things are perpetually entangled with forces outside an individual's control? Ivy's response to this revelation is not to feel betrayed and not to feel relieved. She feels both, and she sits with both, and she ultimately does something that I find genuinely moving. She decides that the origin of an opportunity doesn't retroactively determine its value. That she is here, she has done the work, and the work is real regardless of what opened the door. This is a much more mature and nuanced treatment of the merit versus circumstance question than this show had any obligation to attempt, and the fact that it does attempt it, and does it well. And the result is that it dips slightly from satisfying into almost triumphant in a way that doesn't quite match the show's usual restraint. There's a moment in that sequence that I would describe, if I'm being genuinely critical, as the show congratulating itself, and the show's best instincts are about not congratulating itself. It's a small thing, but it's there. The faculty antagonist's resolution is the most compressed of all the loose threads, and it's the one I feel most genuinely cheated by. I won't go into the specifics of what's revealed or how it resolves, but I will say that the revelation is interesting enough that it deserved more time and the resolution is tidy enough that it feels like it belongs to a slightly different show, a show with less ambiguity and more faith in institutional mechanisms. Given how carefully the show has constructed every other resolution around complexity and gradual process and genuine cost, this one stands out as anomalous. My suspicion, and this is pure guesswork, is that this storyline was intended to run longer and got condensed for reasons that had nothing to do with narrative logic. The bones are good. The execution is rushed. But I want to return to what this show does well, because the well is deep and I haven't exhausted it. One of the things I haven't talked about yet is how the show handles the concept of the academy year itself as a structural container, the fact that everything we're watching happens within a single mating season, which has a finite length, a biological clock ticking underneath every scene. This temporal pressure is genius, honestly, because it gives the story an urgency that it doesn't have to manufacture through plot alone. Even in the slower middle episodes, there's always the ambient awareness that mating season is not indefinite, that whatever configuration these characters find or don't find will be tested when the biological pressure lifts and they're left with only what they actually chose. The show uses this temporal structure to sharpen everything. Scenes that might feel leisurely in a different context carry a slight urgency just by existing within this window of time. The way the show maps character development onto the progression of the season is also genuinely elegant. Early mating season, high pressure, high noise, instincts operating at full volume, corresponds to the most chaotic period of the relationships, when everyone's worst tendencies are most visible and most hard to manage. Mid-season, as biological pressure plateaus and becomes something to live with rather than react to, corresponds to the deepest relationship building, the library scenes, the courtyard scenes, the training facility moment between Ronan and Leon. Late season, as the pressure begins to ebb, is when the real choices emerge, because what's left when the biological mandate quiets is what's actually true, what was actually chosen, what will persist. The season is not just a plot device. It's a dramaturgical architecture, and the show builds inside it with real sophistication. I also want to talk about what the show does with the concept of legacy, because it comes up repeatedly in ways that feel more intentional the more I think about it. Each of the three alphas carries a specific relationship to the legacy of his group: wolf pack duty, lion pride tradition, hawk murder protocol, and in each case the legacy is both genuinely meaningful and genuinely constraining. The show doesn't dismiss these legacies. It doesn't frame the packs and prides and social structures as simply oppressive systems to be escaped. It frames them as things that contain genuine wisdom and genuine community alongside the genuine rigidity that makes them difficult to be human in. When Ronan eventually returns to his pack with a resolved version of his mate's situation, it's not as a rebel who has overthrown the old order. It's as someone who has found a way to honor what matters in the legacy while being honest about what doesn't. Leon does something similar with the pride, though his version is more analytically framed. He presents the resolution as a precedent, as something that the historical record can accommodate if interpreted correctly, which is both exactly the right approach for who Leon is and a gentle comedy of character that the show lets breathe without underlining it. Talon's relationship to Hawk Legacy is the most ambivalent of the three, and the show is honest about that ambivalence. He's not reconciled with the murder's leadership by the final episode, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. What he has is something more personal and less institutional. He has chosen something, and for Talon, whose whole architecture has been about not choosing, about staying aerial and uncommitted and free to redirect at any moment, the act of choosing is the legacy he's creating for himself. The show understands that this is harder for him than for the others, and it honors that by not resolving it neatly. There's a recurring visual in the back half that I want to mention: windows. The show uses windows throughout, but in the final episodes there's a pattern of showing characters at windows, looking out, or in one specific case, looking in, that becomes almost symphonic in its accumulation. Windows as thresholds. Windows as the space between inside and outside, belonging and isolation, civilization and wildness. The hawk imagery around Talon's window scenes is particularly striking. The show keeps framing him at windows with a kind of longing in his posture that reads, in the early episodes, as the longing to leave, but by the later episodes has become something else. The longing to stay and also to have the window available. To belong without being enclosed. And the final time we see him through a window in the series, he's on the inside looking out rather than the outside looking in, and the framing is exactly what you'd expect from a show this attentive to its own visual grammar: different light, different distance, same window. Same Talon. Not the same choice. The performance arc of the actress playing Ivy across the full series is something I want to address now in the context of the full picture, because I praised her early work extensively and I want to talk about how she handles the demands of the final episodes, which are significantly more complex. The early performance is about intelligence and adaptability and the specific quality of not quite fear that the situation requires. The final episodes ask her to play someone who has been fundamentally changed by what she's experienced, not transformed, not remade, but deepened in specific ways that should be visible without being announced. And she does it. There's a quality in the later episodes that I can only describe as earned stillness. She moves through scenes with less need to manage them, less of that active adaptation energy that defined the early performance, because she's in a different position now. She's not navigating. She's inhabiting. The difference is subtle and would probably be invisible if you didn't watch the early episodes back to back with the late ones, but it's real, and it's the mark of a performer who understood the full arc from the beginning and paced herself accordingly. The scene I described earlier, Ivy in the courtyard, taking in all three of them, breathing, saying nothing, is the culmination of this arc. Everything she's doing in that moment is not doing. Not managing, not adapting, not working something through. Just being present in her own life in a way that the first episode made feel almost impossible for her, and that the series has made feel like something she built, step by step, under considerable pressure, with real cost. That image of her in that moment is the series' thesis, quietly delivered without a word. I want to come back to the three alphas one more time in the context of their completed arcs, because I think the full picture changes how you understand each of them from the very beginning. Ronan's arc, seen whole, is about the difference between protection and possession. He begins the series operating as though these things are the same, and the process of the story is his slow, resistive, ultimately genuine recognition that they aren't, and that what he actually wants is not to possess but to protect, and that those two things require completely different postures toward the person being protected. By the final episodes, the way he occupies space around Ivy has changed in a way that's physically specific and entirely deliberate, less barricade, more lateral. He's beside rather than in front of, and the spatial shift encodes the internal one. Leon's arc, Scene Hole, is about the courage of being wrong, specifically the courage of having built an entire identity around being right, around never being in a position of vulnerability or error, and then discovering that the most important thing in your life is something you cannot think your way through, cannot study your way toward, cannot analyze into certainty. And finding out that being wrong about something that matters, being uncertain, being exposed, being in a situation that is simply not reducible to a correct answer, is not the catastrophe his entire self-concept was organized around preventing. His final scene in the series is very quiet and very Leon. He says something precise and analytical and then, halfway through the sentence, he stops, because the analysis doesn't cover what he's actually trying to say, and for the first time in the series he just says the thing directly, without the academic scaffolding, and it's 6 words, and it's everything. I'm going to protect those 6 words. But they're the right 6 words. Talon's arc, Scene Hole, is about altitude. He has spent his entire life at a remove, perched above, surveying, never landing fully. And the series is about the terrifying, disorienting experience of coming down. Not of being brought down, nothing and nobody forces Talon to land. He does it himself, slowly and with enormous resistance and with Ivy's patient, non-pursuing presence as the only thing that makes it seem possible. The altitude was not a flaw. It was a genuine way of seeing. But it was also a loneliness he'd so thoroughly normalized that he'd stopped experiencing it as loneliness and started experiencing it as preference. By the final episode, Talon is on the ground. Not metaphorically, literally, in a scene that directly echoes his early habit of perching on elevated surfaces, he's sitting on actual ground, in the courtyard, and the camera frames him at eye level rather than from below, and the framing change is the show saying, he has landed. Voluntarily. And he is still himself. What these 3 arcs share, and what I think is the show's deepest thematic argument, is the conviction that genuine transformation doesn't require the erasure of what you fundamentally are. Ronan is still territorial and protective by the end. Leon is still precise and analytical. Talon is still aerial in his thinking, still quick and deflective and funny in his first response to things. The show is not asking them to become different people. It's asking them to become more fully who they already are, to stop performing the managed version and access the actual one. And it's making the argument that this kind of transformation is only possible in the presence of someone who genuinely wants the actual version and not the performance, and who will wait for it without making the waiting into a demand. This is the show's most generous idea, and it extends to Ivy herself. She doesn't transform into something that belongs in this world. She becomes more fully the specific kind of person she already was, which turns out to be exactly the kind of person this world didn't know it needed. The question I've been sitting with since finishing the series, and I want to share it because I think it's the most interesting unanswered question the show leaves you with, is about whether the tether is enough. Whether a point of return, a person who makes the wilderness feel safe, a relationship that doesn't require you to manage yourself into something smaller, is a complete picture of love or just its foundation. The show gestures toward this question without answering it, and I think that's the right instinct. It's a question that doesn't have a story-shaped answer. But it's present in the final image, in the morning light, in Ivy walking to class with 3 distinct presences at the edges of her day. Is it enough? For now, the show seems to say. For now, it is. And for now might be all any of us get, and the practice of choosing it anyway might be everything. This show is not going to be for everyone. I want to be precise about who it's for and who might find it genuinely difficult. If you come to it expecting a tight, plot-driven story with clean antagonists and clear resolutions and a second-act pace that doesn't make demands on your patience, you are going to struggle with the middle third. the show prioritizes emotional truth over incident, and there are stretches where not much happens by conventional dramatic standards and a great deal happens by interior character standards, and if your default reading mode is event-oriented, you may find those stretches frustrating in ways that the payoff doesn't fully redeem for you. That's a legitimate response. If you find reverse harem configurations either uncomfortable on principle or too fantastical to take seriously, the show won't convert you. It's not interested in making the case for its romantic structure, it simply inhabits that structure and trusts you to either come with it or not. The lack of apology in that approach is part of what makes the show feel mature, but it does mean there's no on-ramp for a skeptical audience. If you have a low threshold for slow burn in the romantic content specifically, if you need the relationships to be moving at a steady, visible clip rather than accumulating in ways that feel almost imperceptible until they suddenly don't, episodes 4 through 7 are going to require some faith. Not blind faith, the craft is visible throughout, and there are individual scenes in those episodes that I've praised extensively that work completely. But as a whole, that section of the show is asking you to trust that the investment is being made even when you can't fully see the return yet. But if you are someone who finds genuine pleasure in character psychology, in the specific texture of how different people move toward and away from each other, in a story that takes its fantastical premise and uses it to ask real questions about belonging and choice and the terrifying possibility of being fully known, this show is going to give you a lot. A significant amount of it is genuinely great. Some of it is exceptional. And all of it, even the parts that don't fully land, is the work of a production that cares deeply about what it's trying to say and has the craft to say it in a way that stays with you. I've watched this series 3 times now. Once for the story, once for the craft, once just to sit with the experience of it, and each watch has returned something different. The third watch is the one where I fully understood what the show is doing and also fully forgave it for what it isn't doing, and that's a specific quality of experience that I think distinguishes genuinely good storytelling from merely competent storytelling. Genuinely good storytelling gives you new information about itself on re-encounter. Merely competent storytelling exhausts itself on first contact. Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates is, against every expectation this premise invites, genuinely good storytelling. The cast deserves collective credit alongside their individual credits. The chemistry between all 4 leads, which I mentioned in the first half as clearly having been built through production investment in rehearsal and time, is the single biggest practical factor in why the show works as well as it does. You cannot manufacture the kind of ease these 4 performers have with each other on screen. It either exists or it doesn't, and it clearly exists here, and whatever the production did to create the conditions for it, it made the right call. The ensemble scenes, which proliferate in the back half as the central 4 spend more time in the same space, have a quality of genuine ensemble storytelling that's almost theatrical in its texture, and I mean that as high praise. At Jonota News, we talk about the stories that reward serious attention, and this is absolutely one of them. It arrived in 2026 as the kind of release that gets categorized quickly by genre and filed in a box, and what it turned out to be is a genuinely thoughtful, beautifully performed, occasionally imperfect, surprisingly moving piece of storytelling that uses every element of its Shifter Academy world in service of ideas about what it means to be wild and known simultaneously. The title promises taming. What the show delivers is something more interesting, the discovery that the wildness was never the problem. That the thing that needed to change was not the wildness itself but the fear around it, the fear of being seen in it, the fear of it being used against you, the fear of landing. And that when the fear resolves, what's left is not domesticated. It's free. I'll leave you with the image I keep coming back to. Not the courtyard scene, not the morning ending, not any of the big romantic moments or the convergence sequence or the quiet library scenes, as much as I love all of those. The image I keep coming back to is from the very first episode, before any of this begins, Ivy walking onto the academy grounds for the first time, carrying everything she owns, looking up at this impossible Gothic and glass building in the early morning light, and not looking afraid. She looks curious. Like whatever is in there is interesting rather than threatening. Like the world being larger and stranger than expected is information she can work with. That quality, That specific human quality of curiosity as the primary response to the overwhelming is what makes her the right protagonist for this story, and it's what the show spent 12 episodes honoring. It's what the show got right from the very first frame. If you've made it this far with me, thank you genuinely. These long-form reviews are the conversations I most want to be having on Jonota News, and the fact that you're here for it means everything. If you are not subscribed yet and this kind of deep, spoiler-aware storytelling analysis is your thing, the button is right there. But no pressure, just know there's more where this came from. And if you've seen *Shifter Academy, Taming Three Wild Mates *, I really do want to know what you made of it, especially the ending, especially Talon's arc, especially that sound cue in the final that I guarantee you felt without knowing why. Drop it in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going.